Hi everyone. I want to welcome you to this Season 1, Episode 33 of Dead to Rights, the podcast. I'm your host, Ted Carrick. When I first envisioned this weekly project, I had no idea the range of authors we'd be able to present for our listeners. The participation by writers from every genre has been fantastic. We've been able to bring you masters of true crime, thrillers, literature, romantic mysteries, steampunk, sci-fi, memoirs, and young adult. And to fill out the month of August, on the 19th, we'll interview author Mike Rubin, The Cotton Crest Curse, and Cashed Out. And on that day, we'll also have a reading of the short story The Right Choice by yours truly, Ted Carrick, from the anthology 13 Claws by the Mesdames of Mayhem, Carrick Publishing 2017. On August 26th, we'll interview Michelle Cox, author of A Girl Like You and A Ring of Truth. And we'll also have a reading of the short story Family Recipe by Catherine Astolfo from Starship Good Words, Carrick Publishing 2012. Today, though, we're truly delighted to introduce you to a well-established author of cozies for lovers of modern-day murder, she wrote. Our interview this week will be with Edith Maxwell, the McCavity and Agatha-nominated author of the Quaker Midwife Mysteries, County Store, Local Foods, and other mystery series. For our readers on the run, today's short story will be The Peace of Mind Thief, from 5 Scoops as an Addiction by Alec Carrick, Carrick Publishing. But first, some housekeeping. Last week, we featured a fantastic interview with my good friend and fellow author and editor, Ed Pivowarchuk. However, I'm afraid I mispronounced his name, and I apologize for that. If you're looking to connect with Ed, you can find him at the mesdamesofmayhem.com website or on Facebook as Ed Pivowarchuk, and that is spelled Piwowarc, Z for zebra, YK. Also, we're about to unveil a new Dead to Rights icon, so please stay tuned for that and don't lose track of us as a result of the new look. We'll keep the trademark noose and the quill pen for Dead to Rights, but we felt it was important to keep my photo current so you'll know who it is you're engaging with. One of the tips Alec and I always try to impress on new authors is that when you're reaching out, it's imperative to be yourself. People usually won't know your work, and they're rushed. For the most part, they don't have time to explore into unknown literature, and they don't want to take the chance. Media is coming at them from every direction. So, when you dive into online forums, keep it simple. Avoid representing yourself with icons of cat images or flowers or things that don't truly represent who you are. Understandably, some of you may have religious beliefs that prohibit you from posting images of your own face. In those cases, your icon should at least be an image or text that truly represents what it is you hope to offer your readers. Whether you're posting a true photo, a throwback image, or a current version, some combination of text and image that expresses yourself and your work, do your best to keep it real. In my opinion, readers will thank you for it. They want to get to know their favorite authors and their new authors. This is a small thing, but it's a gift you can give the world, the gift of yourself. And now, stay with us for our outstanding interview with McCavity and Agatha-nominated author of the Quaker Midwife Mysteries, Country Store, Local Foods, and other mystery series, Edith Maxwell. Constructing fictional worlds rich with passion, intrigue, and the true mystery of human behavior is what makes Edith happiest. In 2013, she left high tech to write mystery fiction full-time and is now living her dream. Edith is active in Sisters in Crime, serving as the president of the New England chapter, and is a member of Mystery Writers of America. She is also a longtime member of the Society of Friends, Quaker, and the recent past clerk of Amesbury Friends Meeting. Her short story was featured in the National Endowment for the Arts 50th Anniversary Celebration.
Hello.
Good morning, Edith, and welcome to Dead to Rights. This is Donna Carrick. How are you today?
Good morning, Donna. I'm just fine, thank you. How are you?
Good. I'm glad to have you on the show. And it's we're actually talking on Easter weekend, even though the episode will air in August. So happy Easter to you.
Thank you, and to you.
Thanks. Now, I wanted to talk to you about your mystery series. It looks like you've got quite a bit on the go. Your second Quaker midwife mystery series book, Called to Justice, won the Agatha Award for Best Mystery. Is that right?
Actually, it's nominated for an Agatha Award for Best Historical Mystery.
Oh, excellent.
And I will learn at the end of April whether it won or not. But
that's
it's
very
exciting. It's one of 5 nominated.
That is very exciting. We've got our award series here in Canada coming up soon, and actually the shortlist award events are in April, so that's pretty exciting.
Yes.
That's terrific. What can you tell us about that Quaker Mystery Series?
It's set in the same town where I live, here in Amesbury, Massachusetts, up in the northeast corner of the state, in the late 1880s. And I have an independent Quaker midwife who's in her 20s, Rose Carroll, and she travels about town seeing pregnant clients and helping women with their births. But that enables her to be a great amateur sleuth because she also hears secrets and goes places the detectives could never go. For example, women's bedchambers. And she's a Quaker, so she's already a little bit outside the norm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The third book, Turning the Tide, releases next week, and I'm very excited about that. It has a women's suffrage theme. Women turn out on Election Day in 1888, presidential election day, with their placards about giving the women the vote. So I'm also a Quaker, and it's a series that's very close to my heart.
Oh, that's really interesting. That is fascinating. What are the 3 titles? I know the one coming up is Turning the Tide.
The new one is Turning the Tide. The first one was Delivering the Truth. And the 2019 book is Charity's Burden.
Charity's Burden, okay.
Yes.
Will that be the 4th in the series?
That will be the 4th, and
okay.
I have at least one more under contract. So far, I have one more under contract.
That is terrific. Yeah, thank you for telling us about that. And where can this series of books be bought?
Anywhere books are sold. I mean, they're at Barnes and Noble, they're at Amazon, you can order them from your local independent bookstore. They're all available in ebook format as well as print.
Excellent. Now you've got another series called
the version of the first 2 books so far.
Sorry?
I'm sorry. What did you say?
What was that?
I just didn't hear the last thing you asked me. Or is it?
Oh, I was about to ask you about your country store mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
As Maddie Day, Edith writes, wildly popular.
I write them as Maddie Day.
Yes. Okay. And those are with Kensington Publishing. Is that right?
Kensington Publishing. That's right. The Quaker Midwife Mysteries are with Midnight Inc., which is a division of Llewellyn in Minnesota. But Kensington is it's the smallest of the big New York publishers, and it's family owned.
Okay.
And they've been doing a lot with cozy mysteries. So the country store mysteries take place in a country store breakfast and lunch restaurant owned by Robbie Jordan, who's a transplanted Californian, as am I.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very popular series. She serves breakfast and lunch to customers and sells vintage cookware, and manages to get involved in murder after murder. But she's got her cast of friends and relatives. She has her Aunt Adele there, and her friend Phil and her friend Lou, and kind of a quirky police lieutenant also, Buck Bird, who has a lot of very amusing Southern mannerisms in his speech.
Okay. And are these set in Massachusetts as well?
These are what?
Are these also set in Massachusetts?
No, these are in southern Indiana in scenic Brown County.
Okay.
I spent 5 years getting a PhD many decades ago in the neighboring Monroe County at Indiana University. And Brown County is just beautiful. It looks like Vermont. It's hilly. There's a lot of artists, fierce independent spirit, and so it's a perfect place to set a cozy mystery. So it's village based,
Mm-hmm.
And justice is restored.
How many books are there so far in the Country Store Mystery Series?
The fourth book, Biscuits and Slashed Browns, came out in January. The fifth book, Death Over Easy, will be out in July,
Mm-hmm.
right at the end of July, right before we air. And then the sixth book I've turned in and it's been accepted. It's Strangled Eggs and Ham, and that'll be out in July of 2019, I think.
Okay, well, you've got quite a repertoire there. How long have you been writing cozy mysteries?
I've been writing novels seriously since 2009, but my first book took me sort of 3 years to write and polish and sell.
Mm-hmm.
It came out in the fall of 2012, and that's a 2-book series under the pen name Case Baker, Tace, which I'm not writing anymore because it was with a very small press.
Was that the Lauren Rousseau Mysteries?
Huh?
Was that the Lauren Rousseau Mysteries?
Yes, that's the Lauren Rousseau mystery. She's a contemporary Quaker linguistics professor.
Okay.
And
okay.
those are also set in Massachusetts.
Okay.
But then I got a contract with Kensington for the local foods mysteries, which are on an organic farm in Massachusetts. And there's 5 books in that series. But the first one came out in June of 2013. And those come out annually in June. That series, unfortunately, has been discontinued. But there's five good books in it, and I moved on to some more series, so I'm happy.
Good. Now, how does because I didn't realize when I was researching you, I saw that it was a Quaker midwife series, of course, but I didn't stupidly make the connection that that would be your background coming into play. How does it inform your writing?
Yes, well, I have been a Quaker for almost 30 years, about 30 years, as an adult. I wasn't raised a Quaker. It certainly informs the way Rose Carroll conducts herself, and Lauren Rousseau in that series as well. There are strong tenets of equality and nonviolence and simplicity that Quakers follow, and my protagonists do that too. For the rest of my writing, it's what I do personally. I walk to Quaker meeting on Sundays and sit in silent worship with other friends with a capital F.
That's really fascinating, honestly, Edith. I really enjoy hearing about that. Now, what drew you to mysteries?
I've been reading mysteries for decades. For a while, I was reading science fiction, and then I grew up reading mysteries. So my mother had our living room was full of books of all kinds, but there were shelves and shelves of Agatha Christie and Earl Stanley Gardner and mysteries, Poe and Sherlock Holmes, and I grew up reading them. I have an overactive imagination, and I was banned from watching scary movies or TV shows like Twilight Zone.
Right.
But the bookshelves had no limits, no controls on them. So I was reading Sherlock Holmes and Poe when I was probably 9.
Okay, so your story is just like all of us mystery writers, that we grew up reading them, so of course we're drawn to them. I love that you were reading Poe at 9. That's really good.
Yeah. I mean, I have a story I tell at author events sometimes. My bedroom had a solid plain white ceiling, and I knew that when the light was on. As soon as the light was off, I knew there was a grate in the ceiling, and the speckled band was going to come down and get me. After I read the speckled band, and I would lie there paralyzed, not able to sleep.
Oh dear.
So I've had a long history with an overactive imagination. But when I was about 30 years ago, 35, I was reading Robert Parker, and I was reading mysteries and some science fiction written by men with male protagonists. And I got really tired of
Hmm.
reading about women's legs and women's upper parts, and that's when Sarah Paretsky and Sue Grafton and Catherine Hall Page and Susan Wittig Albert were writing their books. Not
Hmm.
all cozies, but all female protagonists written
Hmm.
by women. And I didn't have to read that stuff anymore. So that's really what I love to read, and that's why I write mysteries with female protagonists.
And those women changed the playing field for us. I mean, we
That's,
really owe them an awful lot. Sarah
yes,
Paretsky, I was a huge fan. Sue Grafton, I know, so prolific, and
yes,
just really changed the playing field for us. So I'm with you on that for sure.
very
You
much.
mentioned that you were
And
a,
Sarah Paretsky and some of those women were the founding mothers of Sisters in
of
Crime.
course.
And I'm now the president of our New England chapter, which is one of the biggest chapters in Sisters in
Wow,
Crime. And I'm really
congratulations. Yeah.
proud to be able to do that.
Yeah, I've been a member since 1998 of Sisters in Crime Toronto chapter, and
Uh-huh.
I'm proud to be a member, even though I don't get out to meetings the way I would like to and the way I used to. But I
Yeah.
maintain that membership and those connections. People who don't write, I don't think they always realize how important it is to us to network. You know.
Oh, exactly. To find your tribe,
Yeah.
to find your people.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I've made lifelong friends through the Sisters in Crime and through Crime Writers in Canada, and I wouldn't give them up for anything. They really
yeah,
are my
yeah.
nearest and dearest.
Same here. I blog with 5 other New England mystery authors, cozy mystery authors. Well, although many of us are branching out a little bit, the wicked cozy authors. And we're blog mates, but we're also really good friends. And we meet we go away on a retreat every year for, in person for a long weekend. And if there's something about the publishing industry we want to talk to somebody about, but we don't want to make it public on Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
we just do an email thread in the background
Yes.
and share information and gripe and everything. It's
It's a
fabulous.
great way to learn what's going on, really, and to ask those questions that you might feel embarrassed to ask publicly. I mean, not that we should feel embarrassed anyway. I mean, the things we
Yeah.
don't know are only the things we're willing to learn. So.
Mm-hmm.
But I know what you mean. Sometimes it's better just to, I know I've got several, probably about a dozen ladies that I can call anytime or they can call me, and something's going on behind the scenes that they
Yeah.
just want to share or they want to ask about or they want my
Yeah. And it's
opinion or whatever.
and
So,
in some sense, we're all in competition with each other. But I have never met a more supportive, generous group of colleagues
yeah.
than in Sisters in Crime.
And I have
I
to be
had met
honest, I've
coming up,
never
and now,
Yeah, I've never personally felt in competition with the other women in
no.
our writers groups. I know that in a sense we are, but then in another sense we're not because each one of us is so unique. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the people who like what I write may not like what another, you know. I
Yeah.
mean, it just works out that way. And I think that
Exactly.
readers pick up on the fact that we do all support each other, and I think they like that.
I think so too. I
Yeah.
mean, even this year and last year, both times, my book was nominated for Best Historical, an Agatha Award for the Best Historical Mystery, as was Jessie Crockett's, my blogmate, one of
Mm-hmm.
my best writing friends. And, of course I hope I win, but I also hope she wins.
Yes.
um,
Yes.
so,
Hmm. We have a group that got together a number of years ago, in 2013 actually, and started working on anthologies together. And so when any story in the anthology is nominated, we're all so excited because the whole book, of course, is our baby. We all contribute in our own ways and we all work on it. And, so it's so exciting when any one story is nominated.
fabulous. Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. That's exactly how I feel.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Now, you said that
Did I miss you at Toronto? Were you at VoucherCon?
I was not because BoucherCon is at a time of year when I just can't get away.
Yeah.
Now, they actually, this time when they were in Toronto, they actually changed the date so that it did not fall on Canadian Thanksgiving for the first time ever.
Oh, right.
But it was too late. I just, by the time I realized that, I just couldn't sign up and change One of
Yeah.
these days I will get to VoucherCon, though. I would love to.
I had a wonderful time in Toronto. I went walking around by myself sometimes between sessions and explored, and I was really
What did you get to
uh,
see?
oh, I didn't go. Well, I went to this. I think it's called the St. Lawrence Market.
Yes.
Um, but I also just walked around, and there are all these high rises, and then there's a little 19th century house or building,
Yes.
and I love that mixture of the old and new. It was,
Mm-hmm.
and
Well,
there
the
was just so much
downtown.
energy and so many young people. I really had a good time. Yeah.
The downtown of Toronto is changing so rapidly that many of us don't even recognize it anymore. I'm transplanted as well. My family is originally from the East Coast, and we moved in '75 to Toronto. So I do consider it my home at this point. But it's
Yeah.
changing so rapidly that every time we get downtown, it's different.
I
And
bet. I mean, building was going on everywhere. Absolutely everywhere.
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm,
My sister is a Canadian. She lives in Ottawa. She's been a Canadian for several decades. She used to live in Quebec. Now
mm-hmm.
she lives in Ottawa.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
used to live in Quebec, in northern Quebec. I know that Ottawa is right on the Quebec-Ontario border, so one of our relatives lived in Ottawa most of her life, and we used to go and visit her there. Yeah.
It's a lovely city.
Now,
Yeah.
you'd said that you were a transplanted Californian. When did you move?
Oh, I left California in 1975 on a series of moves. I went to Japan and taught English for a couple of years, and then I applied to graduate schools and moved to Southern Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I got a job in Boston, and I've never left Massachusetts. So I've now lived in Massachusetts longer than I lived in California.
Yeah, yeah. My
But I still have lots of
extended
relatives
family
and
has a
one brother
strong
in
Boston
California.
connection. So because we're East
Yeah.
Coasters, and so there was a lot of family integration back and forth between Boston and New Brunswick and Nova Scotia.
Oh,
Those
absolutely.
those
Yeah.
areas, yeah, were a lot of back and forth. So I always have a strong affinity for Boston.
Oh, yeah. It's beautiful. Wonderful city.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's really beautiful in imagination. I haven't seen it for so long that God knows what it looks like now.
Well, it's changed, but it has a lot that hasn't changed too. The
Yeah,
winding, confusing streets and old buildings.
yeah,
There's pretty good historic preservation around here. Um,
yeah.
I've found in this whole area. I lived in well, I've lived all the houses I've lived in New England, in Massachusetts, have been antique houses except one, and that one was built in 1960, which is not antique, but
Mm-hmm.
um, and I love living in old houses. The house we live in now, is actually the house that Rose, my Quaker midwife, lives in
Mm-hmm.
my book, because it was built in 1880 for the mill workers just down the street. The
Mm-hmm.
mill was down the street, and so I love walking around town and imagining my midwife
Well,
walking
I could
around.
just imagine you must have had a field day in Toronto because different neighborhoods in Toronto are just filled with old houses, and the history of building the city is quite something too. So,
Oh,
I have a
really
friend
get into that,
on
right?
Facebook. I don't know her personally, but she writes about the history and development of Toronto. That's what her field of expertise is, and it's just fascinating.
Mm.
And the gentrification of the old places. There's a place, if you ever come to the city again, called the Mill Street Brewery and the Brewery District, and you really must get there if you come again. It's just gorgeous.
Oh, I would love to, and we always go to breweries. In fact,
I I
my
saw.
launch party for Turning the Tide is at a brewery, a new brewery right here in town in an historic building
And when
on
is the
April
launch
11th.
party taking place?
It's April 11th. It's a Wednesday night
Mm-hmm.
at Brewery Sylvaticus,
Mm-hmm.
which only opened last fall in an old mill building. They've
Well,
done a
your
great job
topic
of
is
preserving.
fascinating, turning the tide. I love to see that from a historical point of view. The suffragette movement. I love reading about it too. So I think listeners who like to read would love that. And that is the Quaker Midwife series. And
Yes,
the third book is called Turning the Tide, coming out April 7th, I think.
April 8th.
April 8th. Okay. So look
Yeah,
for that.
yeah. Um, and Quakers were in the forefront of the suffrage movement anyway. Um, and I have Elizabeth Cady Stanton come to town and rally the suffragists, and And
Mm-hmm.
John Greenleaf Whittier, the poet and abolitionist, who was also a Quaker, he lived here in Amesbury, and he's in every book.
Mm-hmm.
And so he stands with the women in their demonstration line after he comes out from voting for a while.
How much research do you need to do? And just pardon me for 1 second, Edith. I'm still got the residual bit of a cough. I'll edit that out,
Oh,
so
yeah.
don't worry. All my stumbling around, I'll edit out too, so we'll sound a lot smoother when I get it together. It's just
um,
terrible. Terrible trying to do these things when you're really not that well. But what was my chain of thought? I wanted to ask you.
I've already lost it too. You asked about my research.
Oh, yes. What can you tell our
Yes.
listeners about the amount of research that goes into historical novels like these?
Well, there's a lot. Um, some of it I do up front. Some of it carries through series on series. Book on book in a series. And some I have to do fresh for every series.
Mm-hmm.
So I've researched um, how Quakers talk, um, carriages, um, daily life, like cooking and cleaning, and what underwear was like, and how they brush their teeth. um,
Uh-huh. All the too much
electricity,
information stuff.
and police procedures. So fingerprinting wasn't developed yet in 1888, 1889. But I got a manual. Let's see, it's right here. It's called the Massachusetts Peace Officer, a manual for sheriffs, constables, and police from 1880. I have a reproduction of it. And I learned, and it's all these little case studies. So I learned that when they arrested someone, the police officer had to lay his hand on the person's arm as he said the words, "You're under arrest," or "I arrest you for."
Okay.
So nobody else but me might know that, but I know that it's accurate.
Mm-hmm.
I have a guide to midwifery from 1870. Language, I'm always checking, was this word used in 1888? I wanted to use the word gumshoe for detective.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really thorough online site called the Online Etymology Dictionary, which gives you history of words.
Okay.
And that word wasn't used till like 1905 or 1903,
Okay.
so I can't use gumshoe.
Till the dawn of noir, of course. Yeah.
Like, can I use the word employee, or do I need worker? So I look up language a lot, and of course I have a PhD in linguistics, so I'm interested in language anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I do a lot of research, but then for each particular book, like Turning the Tide is election day. Okay, where did they vote?
Mm-hmm.
What color were the suffragist sashes? Um, and then I learned that each party got a different colored ballot as they went in,
Mm-hmm.
and women would make an election cake, this huge cake, and give out a piece to everybody who voted for that party.
A little bribery.
So those kinds of things I researched anew for each book.
And some of the issues that would have been really important in the day, aside or related to the suffragette movement, for example, proper care for women. I mean, in the midwife calling, for example, the stats on difficult births must have been quite high.
They were high, yeah. I've already written two babies that died, one from being premature, one from getting a respiratory infection a couple days after birth.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to write those, but they were part of life.
Yeah.
I haven't yet written a woman who died during childbirth, but actually the fourth book, there's a woman who dies of an apparent miscarriage, and it turns out it was a botched abortion.
Oh, gee.
Which is painful.
Yeah.
But these things, they happened. That was part of life.
That's right. That's right.
And most babies were stillborn at home. There were starting to be doctors taking over birthing. There were starting to be lying in hospitals,
Mm-hmm.
the hospitals. And that I've learned is partly because all these immigrant women were coming to the cities to work, and then they would get married and stay in the city and have their babies, but they didn't have that network of their mothers and sisters and aunts around to help them with everything. So then they started needing an institution to be born at. Or not needing, whatever. It's an evolution. But in the late 1880s, certainly most births were still home.
Well, it's a fascinating history, and I think for women in particular, we can't really understand our equality, or in some cases our lack of equality, until we understand the history of what brought us here. And the Quakers certainly played a huge role in that evolution for women. So a lot of credit there. Also, for I know that a lot of our listeners will have loved the series Call the Midwife. I don't know if you're familiar with it, Edith, but
I've watched every single episode.
oh, we loved it. We loved it. Our standard family joke is, I bet you there's going to be a baby born this week.
And I think they do a great job with the births.
They
I've
did.
been at a number of home births myself, of friends, and some years ago, when my two sons, who are now around 30, when they were little kids, I had a small organic farm, and I taught childbirth education. I taught prepared childbirth classes in my living room. And so, as part of my training for that, I had to attend a number of births, and many of them were home births.
Okay.
And so I think the midwives I think the show does a great job with those.
I think it does too. We really liked it. And for our listeners who did enjoy Call the Midwife, I think you're going to enjoy the Quaker Midwife Mysteries as well. So please look it up by Edith Maxwell and enjoy, please. Edith, you don't seem like somebody who could possibly have 30-year-old sons. Your voice is so youthful.
Oh, no, I have silver hair, believe me.
Okay. So you're in my same category. We get to a point where we do know what.
He's getting married in September, and the other one is 29 and lives in Puerto Rico, and he'll be home. They're both coming. They're both going to be here for Easter, so I'll see them.
Oh, that's terrific. That's terrific. Well, I'll get you back. I'll let you get back to your Easter planning, and I really want to thank you for coming on the show, Dead to Rights. And but before you go, I've got a couple more things to ask you. One is, we're going to air this in August. So, do you have any events coming up in the late summer or early fall that you want to tell our listeners about?
I will be. I think the day it airs, I'll be traveling back from attending the Writers Police Academy in Wisconsin, which is a fabulous event. I went 9 years ago when it was in North Carolina. It's just a bunch of police officers and firefighters and detectives and forensics people and medical examiners who tell writers how to write accurately about police procedure. It's not a appearance for me personally, but it's an educational thing.
Oh, that sounds terrific. And I would imagine you'll be going to BoucherCon again, will you? Where is it being held this year?
This year I'm not going to BoucherCon because our niece is getting married in Colorado on September 15th, and my son is getting married in Maryland on September 29th. And for me to go away the week before the Colorado trip,
yeah,
too much.
That's quite enough events.
I have to miss.
Yeah, for one season, that's quite enough events. And the last thing I want to ask you, Edith, is do you have any tips for our new authors who may be listening?
Oh, for new authors or aspiring authors, my tip is really sit in that chair and keep your fingers on the keyboard. I mean, you can't do anything if you don't write the best book you can write.
Mm-hmm.
You can't try to sell it. You can't polish it. You can't publish it if you haven't written it.
Yeah.
So I have completed my Turning the Tide is my 13th novel. I've completed 19.
That's fantastic.
And I know by now that the middle is always going to be hard for me. I'm going to get stuck. I'm going to want to give up. I'm going to say, this is a terrible book. I don't have a story. I'll never finish it. No one will like it. And I know that if I keep writing, I can finish it, and then I can make it better. So really it's, write the book, right, and then make it the best book you can write. And as we talked about earlier, find your tribe.
Pardon me. Pardon me, Edith. Sorry about that. That is just awful.
Learn from them. Ask them for endorsements. Then they'll ask you for endorsements when they're coming up. And also enjoy the ride. So if you do have a contract, if you do have a release date, if you do have your debut novel, enjoy it, because you're never going to have a first novel again.
Yeah, that's terrific. Stay on the line with us, Edith, for just a second, and I'm going to stop the recording and chat with you for 1 sec.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
It was really our pleasure. Thank you. My heartfelt thanks to Edith Maxwell for offering such terrific insights to our listeners. And now, please join me for our Readers on the Run segment, featuring a short story by my husband and partner in all things, Ted Carrick, titled The Peace of Mind Thief, from World Enough and Crime, Carrick Publishing, 2014. Editor's note. We began our carousel of crime with an exploration of secrets, and it's fitting we should end with a tribute to those imps of evil. Ted Carrick shares his exceptional wit and wordcraft as we join him in the bucolic town of Quiet Bay. Secrets. Sugar sprinkled on candy, or arsenic mixed with nightshade. Are you in the know or flying blind? Delicious seductive power or unpredictable happen anytime pain? Who to bring into the inner circle? Who best left excluded? Where to extend the intimacy? And implication of purity that's non-existent? Most secrets aren't. Obscuring the truth, they rarely reveal, rather standing in the way of a conclusion. Birthing misconceptions, resentment, and anger are their own twin companions. Still, this was a secret she knew she'd take to her grave. What surprised most was her certainty she could carry through with intent. Her resolve was usually less firm. In this, there were reasons to stay the course. What she had done turned out so well. She'd rolled the dice and won the treasure. No more tempting fate. Cash in her winnings. Accept the good and dare not look back, and never, ever share. Thankfully, she had an advantage, a secret within a secret. She was the only person who knew what she was hoarding. Most of the townspeople of Quiet Bay were upset. The source of the disharmony had been festering for more than a year. At first, it was viewed as a joke, but matters had progressed beyond that stage. Plenty of meetings had been held on the subject. It was a constant topic of conversation. Some were holding their emotions in check, hoping that legal action would solve the matter, although so far that had proven ineffective. A victory in the courts 1 month led, upon appeal, to a setback the next. The source of the problem was only a 5-minute walk out of the center of the village, along the beachfront. A certain Mr. Gary Willikers was in the process of building an enormous structure on land that most people had taken for granted was public property. Mr. Willikers was one of the community's few celebrities, not because of anything he'd done to earn the acclaim. Instead, his notoriety derived from his profession. He was in the real estate business. True to what he'd seen in his travels to southern environs, he'd adopted a simple marketing ploy, blitz advertising. He'd seen the signs everywhere. Live like a Hilton when you buy with Milton was his favorite. He tweaked the message and plastered his picture everywhere with the caption, "Sell with me and say, gee Willikers, that was easy." Lately, though, his business had been in a tailspin. He'd pulled some deals judged to be questionable by his neighbors and fellow residents. Through no fault of his own, some properties he'd helped move were now worth a good deal less than they had been a year or two ago. Taking advantage of the downturn in the market, he'd also made a purchase for his own use that violated what some thought was fair play. Exhibit number 1, Miss Hook. Shortly before she died in a care facility, Mr. Willikers bought her home down on the lakefront. The word around town was he'd picked it up for a song. Ms. Hook needed money for medical expenses, and he'd stepped in as a sugar daddy with a hidden motive. Or so the story went. The reality was he'd struck a fair bargain, what with prices dropping as quickly as they were. The cost of gasoline was going through the roof, and vacation homes were falling out of favor, given the long drive from major cities. Mr. Willikers had a specific plan in mind for Ms. Hook's land. His real love, and another reason his real estate business was withering, was astronomy. He built a permanent wooden deck over the sand in his new backyard, from which he could gaze at the stars. That alone would have been bad enough. The shoreline had always offered a free and open stroll along its entire length. It was phase 2 of his project that really set everyone's ire to jangling. In keeping with his theme, he was well along in constructing a giant wooden rocket ship on top of his new patio, with a set of stairs ascending to the top. At the summit, he planned a flight deck to serve as his astronomical lookout. In the earliest stages of his projectile project, the ridicule began. The townspeople turned nasty. They were upset over the disruption to their routines. They started to speak of Mr. Willikers as a space alien. Maybe he came from the stars, was the joke. He should go back where he came from, was what a lot of them thought and said. For a certainty, something must be done to stop work on the aberration. Extraordinary measures were justified and needed. Chester Nails was the owner of the local hardware store. He ran an independent operation affiliated with a big corporate chain. The locals weren't pleased with him either. Whenever he was asked what he thought of the monstrosity, his response was always measured. He wasn't sure it was so bad. Maybe it would be a case of unintended consequences. He was aware it might change the town. A giant wooden spaceship on the water's edge could be a tourist attraction. Had anyone thought of that? Not likely. Not among the mental heavyweights who were his staff and customers. Whenever he talked about the possible benefits, he received looks that suggested he might be the one from Saturn. That morning had been a perfect example. Mr. Nails was as loyal to his wife and family as a steak and onions man could be. It didn't make him a monk, though, did it? He had no control over where his wanton imaginings might take him. He wasn't ever going to act on them, but the journey provided most of his daily joy. At least he could cultivate his pleasant imaginings, and where better to plow a furrow than in Herzinger's drugstore, 4 retail outlets down the street from his own. That's where, on any given day, he'd run into Holly Hoodie, the prettiest girl in town and full-time cashier. Balding, middle-aged, and of average height, Mr. Nails was unaccountably a dandy in one area. He was the proud owner of a dozen pairs of high-end sunglasses. If he tried on enough shades and got the timing just right, Holly would come over and help him with his choice. She'd give her opinion about how he looked. It cracked open an opportunity to converse in other areas. Ah, the sweet delight of talking with an intelligent young woman. Mr. Nails would leave the store ecstatic. It would be the highlight of his day. He'd often walk back to his own emporium with a secret smile so big it would have been nice to push it in a shopping cart. He barely acknowledged to himself what he was doing. If he thought it went unnoticed by everyone else, he was sorely mistaken. Small towns hold few secrets. Few and far between were those who weren't aware of his silly infatuation. Holly had a boyfriend, the local leader of the town's questionable element. All such small ponds have a bad boy, someone who finds their own particular niche by being a little wilder than others. Sex appeal was the desired spin-off from being on the outs with the law. Sidney Steeler may have been a renegade, but he was also smart. He knew his charisma was enhanced by dating Holly, the daughter of the local police officer who headed up the local constabulary. Young Mr. Steeler was becoming a problem for Chester Nails. Not only was Holly obviously attracted to Sid, but there were rumors Chester's own son had become a disciple as well. Socially awkward, hero-worshipping teenage boys gravitated to Sid like he was a drumstick. As a consequence, Chester's son had become increasingly disrespectful, while also growing careless about keeping up his studies and other duties. One inscrutable teenager at a time, Chester thought, as he turned his mind back to Holly. That morning, during another harmless dalliance, Holly brought up a distasteful subject. She'd been talking to Sid, and it was his opinion that someone should blow up Gary Williker's rocket ship. Chester uncharacteristically went ballistic. "That's a ridiculous notion. The man has a right to do with his property whatever he likes. We can't be taking matters into our own hands." He was immediately sorry. The crestfallen look on Holly's face made him feel miserable. He briefly tried to smooth things over, but his efforts fizzled, and he soon took his leave. His mood remained out of sorts long into the workday. Chester understood where he'd gone wrong. Sid's leitmotif was the roar of his Kawasaki motorcycle. Chester's was the sound of the garage door opening and closing when he drove off and returned in the family van. He was still distracted at dinner that evening. Even later, when he climbed into bed with his wife, a surprising series of speculations poured out of him. He explained to her, hypothetically of course, how he would deal with the matter of Mr. Williker's pet project. He'd simply do it. It would be risky, maybe a 50-50 proposition, but it was the only way it might work. He'd find an excuse for being out at night on a regular basis, so she would become used to his absences and sleep through them. He added a playful embellishment. He'd claim he was going for a moonlight skinny dip. Then one night he'd sneak down the beach through the water and launch a Molotov cocktail. He'd make sure it was untraceable, something like petrol and a fuse in a large plastic baggie. There were risks. Somebody might spot him, and he certainly didn't want to hurt anyone who might be in the vicinity. He'd have to count on luck. But if the cards fell right, it was doable. Mrs. Nails listened to his story. This wasn't her husband as she knew him. She was astonished by his inner resolve. Most of all, she was surprised to learn he was so upset about the matter. It had never surfaced before. When she finally coaxed out the reason for his annoyance, she was impressed by the simplicity of his explanation. Gary Willikers may not have done anything wrong in a strict legal sense, but the truth of the matter is he's stolen the town's peace of mind. One tumultuous week after the town's problem had been fixed, permanently and emphatically, Phoebe Nails, Chester's wife, was sitting in her living room when her teenage son came in after school. She knew Benji was simply checking in before stepping out with his buddies. She'd only see him again the next morning at breakfast. He never seemed to do homework. He was showing up for classes at least as far as she knew, and for that she was grateful. She hadn't heard anything to the contrary from the school's principal, who also performed double duty as Quiet Bay's long-serving mayor. Whenever she saw the village's top authority figure, she was sure to inquire. Benji came in through the back door, and after a brief, violent fridge raid in the kitchen, walked in to say hello to his mother, positioned strategically on his exit route. He'd have been pleasant enough in appearance except for the scowl that now often skewed his countenance. At first, Phoebe assumed her son might be having girl trouble, But she was coming to entertain a different conclusion. She switched to worrying that Benji was disappointed by his parental examples. That wasn't fair. It would have to stop, she decided. "Hi, Ben," she said. "How was your day?" "Boring. Same as always," was his uninspiring response. "I'm sure it was better than that," she answered cheerily. "No, it was really lame. Nothing decent to say about it at all, really," he said, with no enthusiasm. Phoebe was becoming fed up with her son's moods. There was being a teenager, and then there was immersion in the persona of a surly cur. Maybe they were the same thing. Still, this wasn't how she'd imagined her family would turn out. She wasn't willing to lie down and take it. Benji had been such a fun-loving and sparkly child. She had no idea where things had gone wrong. She and her husband often talked about it. He had even less of a clue. Maybe it was TV, or video games, or peer pressure, or something in the local water supply. Maybe he was simply a bad seed. No, his whole generation seemed to be comprised of snarly malcontents. They couldn't all be rotten. That was too easy an answer. Had she and Chester been lax as parents? Possibly. She'd known a much harsher discipline in her own upbringing and had resolved not to impose the same on her kids. Maybe the reality is that children need a firm hand, even if it has other undesirable consequences. As much as it was hard to endure personally, it was Ben's lack of respect for his father that grated her most. She knew, by tone of voice and offhand comment, that Benji thought his dad was a stick in the mud. "Ben, come and sit down," she said. "I have something important I want to discuss with you." "Not now, Mom. I have to meet Sid and the guys, and I want to be out of the house before Dad gets home." "I'm mystified, Ben. What's so great about Sid?" "Are you kidding? You know what he did about the rocket pad, right? The whole town was in an uproar, and he came up with the solution. He's a hero." "The sheriff doesn't think so," she offered. Benji remained firm in his admiration. "Yeah, well, Sid told us guys what he did. He's the man, right?" "And you don't suppose he's lying?" she couldn't help but ask. "No way. You adults, Dad, the mayor, the sheriff, you all just sat around talking. You didn't do anything. Sid took action." Phoebe nodded her head. She looked at him with a serious expression. "I have a problem with your father I'd like to discuss." That spun his attention in another direction. "A problem with Dad?" he responded. For the first time in a long while, Benji looked puzzled. He wasn't used to his mother having any issues with Chester. They were a team. They presented a united front when it came to dealing with him and his foibles. In his experience, they didn't have setbacks of their own. He did some quick mental math and figured he could spare a moment to listen to what his mother had to say. He sat next to her on the orchid-patterned couch. It was a plush affair with doilies on the arms, something that would have fit more appropriately in his grandmother's house. He'd once come across the word antimacassar in a book and looked it up in a dictionary. Sticky note fashion, he'd attached its meaning to his brain. It was his proclivity for doing such things that informed him he might be a little smarter than most, as if that would ever get him out of this place. Benji was one of those kids. There are a million of them. He was sure the people he was living with weren't his real parents. He must be adopted. There could be no other explanation. His true lineage was royalty, but he'd been separated from the king and queen at birth for some reason having to do with palace intrigue. Someday an envoy would come and rescue him, but for now he'd have to put up with far less than was his due. Phoebe studied her son and then began to tell him about a possible alternative explanation for what had occurred 7 days before, with Benji's father as the chief protagonist. First, she made it clear he was never to mention any of this to anyone. Especially he must never let it slip to Chester that he was aware of what had transpired. Soon, during pauses, she could hear a jaw drop. A short distance away, Adriana Willikers, Gary's spouse, was also reflecting on the events of the past week. It had been a discordant 7 days. Alone at her ornate dining room table, she was drinking a second cup of cappuccino. Adriana was a quiet woman who cherished her dignity. Given that her husband was so flamboyant, most people concluded she was mousy. They had it backwards. She could reach down and find enough resolve to startle anybody. Maybe it was her Italian background. A heritage of ruling the world, albeit 2,000 years earlier, was coursing through her blood. She'd met Gary at university. His flame of confidence was too often blanketed by a lack of drive. Her personality was kept to a simmer by a strong will that feared a dangerous burn. As a couple, their combined thermostat sometimes swung to one extreme or the other, but most often it was set at just the right temperature. In this most recent instance, burdened by the distress her family was experiencing, she'd lanced the boil. She'd spotted her chance and taken appropriate, if attention-grabbing, action. A week earlier, Gary and their son, Bud, had driven 50 kilometers to the one cinema in the vicinity, located in Springdale, that mecca of urbanity, to see another of the horror movies they liked so much, something about the Evil Dead. Besides, it was her night to have fun with the ladies. This was a recent departure from her usual reclusive ways. Phoebe Nails, aware of Adriana's increasing isolation on account of her husband's obsession, had invited her into an arts and crafts group that had been surprised to receive a speedy yes. This was the night of her inauguration, when she received the loose-knit violet-hued scarf that all the ladies wore around their necks while they were working together on their projects. As the newbie, it was her turn to supply the food. She'd spent the afternoon preparing shells and cream filling according to her mother's impossible-to-botch cannoli recipe. Halfway through the evening, she retired to the kitchen to arrange her culinary contribution on a tray in an appealing arrangement. Henceforth, she'd never be sure to what degree she had actually planned what came next, or whether it was simply a matter of the stars coming into fortuitous alignment. Alone in the kitchen, hearing the buzz of conversation in the living room, and knowing the other women would soon be gossiping about her husband's carpentry work, she slipped out of the house. The Nails lived 5 doors east along the beach from her own abode. She walked quickly along the shoreline and onto her rear grounds. The sound of gentle waves washing in and meeting resistance from the ill-placed deck might have been soothing under other circumstances. That afternoon, Gary had told her about his newest, outside-the-box idea. He'd purchased an old propane barbecue and was keeping it in the shed. He planned to modify the unit by removing the lid and taking the gas lines out of the casing. He hoped that, if he placed the modified contraption under his pet project and turned it on at night, he could simulate a jet-fired launch. Or maybe spike up the flames for an afterburner effect. This was all becoming too much for her. Her husband was being ostracized by the rest of the community. Bud's answer was to escape into the trouble that was sure to arise from hanging around with Sidney Steeler's gang. Satisfaction of Gary's fantasy was costing them dearly. This latest scheme of his was dangerous to boot. Better to rid the family of the festering sore in a controlled, deliberate manner. She went to the shed, pulled out the barbecue, and rolled it under the looming wooden structure. She stepped into her home briefly to locate a long-stemmed lighter. She also went to a cupboard where she'd been keeping solidified bacon grease from an earlier frying effort in a large can. Afterwards, she realized this did indeed indicate a measure of premeditation. Back outside again, she smeared some of the grease onto the lower superstructure. The rest she spread upon the grill of the barbecue. She turned a valve and pulled the trigger on the lighter. Initial small flames almost immediately roared up ominously. She stepped back quickly. The flames were angry. In no time, Gary's pet project began to burn. She wheeled the barbecue back to the shed and sped back to her social gathering. Re-entering the living room with a tray full of goodies, no one appeared to have noticed her slightly extended absence. As for subsequent speculation about who had done the shocking deed that night, Sidney Steeler provided a convenient diversion. To embellish his own villainous image, he'd insisted on stealing the spotlight. Adriana could never admit to her husband what she'd done. It was important for him to believe his ambitions had been thwarted by at least one member of an angry mob. How let down would he feel to discover it was his wife who had perpetrated the crime? Just the same, she knew it was time to make important changes in her life. Mix in with the other members of the community with firmer commitment. The quilting bee was the obvious entry point. She'd already established a beachhead. She was sure their undeclared leader, Phoebe Nails, was a woman of substance. Her fanciful designs stepped outside the norm. Most people were oblivious to their quirkiness. Phoebe's pictures were fraught with subliminal messages. She specialized in barnyard scenes. If one looked carefully, one could see that different species were giving each other come-hither looks. While there was nothing overt taking place, Adriana knew there was a subtext. She was dying to ask Phoebe if her suspicion was correct. But that wasn't the sort of thing one could do cold. There had to be a build-up of familiarity. It was all very intriguing, to say the least. 2 weeks had passed since the notorious event, and Phoebe Nails was taking her usual afternoon break from her household chores. Incapable of sitting idly, she was sketching a pattern for another blanket project to go in the spare room. Or maybe she'd sell it at the upcoming church bazaar, as she often did. It was a cozy thought, speculating on how the various outputs from her nimble fingers were warming people all over time, especially since so few of her friends and neighbors seemed aware of what was really captivating about her craftsmanship. As it always did these days, her mind bounced back to a more potent wellspring of interest. What she'd done in telling Benji that fanciful story was far outside her comfort zone. It had required a measure of imagination and even a level of acting skill she'd previously not known she possessed. The look of incredulity on her son's face as the narrative unfolded was worth everything. It was good that he would begin to see things differently. For his own survival, he had to realize the world isn't as straightforward as he might suppose. There were nooks and crannies of truth that one could spend a lifetime spelunking without ever reaching the back of the cave. Look at her. Who would ever figure she'd know the meaning of the word spelunking? She and Benji shared affection for vocabulary. Maybe that's what would eventually convey him from their sleepy stream to a swifter flowing river. He could be an English teacher or a reporter somewhere south in one of the large cities. She chuckled about the skinny dipping reference. What had inspired Chester to add that pinch of spice? It had been years since he'd actually done anything so bold. When they were kids, the chemistry between them had been sufficient to strip away inhibitions. A moonlit naked romp in refreshing waters had been one of the adventures that bound them together when they started dating. As for her husband's role in taking care of the town's problem, she really had no idea whether he'd set fire to the spaceship or not, nor did she care. Nonfiction or false, the imagery had apparently ignited a spark under Benji, Both she and Chester were incredulous when he'd descended the stairs for breakfast that morning and said he'd like to spend more time helping out around the store after school and on weekends. He'd graced them with a shy smile. His essence was more assured, as if warmed by an incredible secret. "Will wonders never cease?" she whispered to herself. Now, if she could just get the goat in her latest barnyard scene to look at that sprightly young cow in a lascivious manner, her day would be complete. It wouldn't do to make the randy intent too obvious, nor the returning leer too welcoming. Barely discernible was her guiding credo. It was the sort of challenge she really enjoyed. Her Mother Earth face glowed. Toward the end of the business day, Gary Willikers came into Chester Nail's hardware store. Unsure how his approach would be received, but driven by innate decency, Chester went up to Gary and said, "Too bad about your building project. I thought maybe you had something there." Gary was mildly surprised to be openly addressed on the subject. "Yes, well, dreams rarely come true, but I do regret the way things turned out." Chester was puzzled by Gary's calm. "You don't seem too upset." Gary gave Chester a cockeyed look. His expression turned reflective. "You know what? You're right. I thought I'd be horribly upset. Before there are momentous changes in our lives, we imagine them with all kinds of reservations. Then they happen, and you realize it was the build-up that was so stressful. The aftermath might be anything. It's almost certain not to be what you expect. How do any of us cope with life? What a struggle. I just wanted to do something different. It was the kind of thing my father would have done. He liked grand gestures. But clearly it was upsetting a lot of people. I tried my hardest. Now it's been taken out of my hands." Chester jumped in. "In effect, you've been provided with an excuse." "You're a wise man, Chester," Gary said. "In short, yes." "So, what can I help you with today?" said the shopkeeper. "Well, I want to spend more time with Bud. He says he'd like to go camping with me." "Sounds like an excellent idea. What can you show me in the way of equipment?" Chester's response to such a question was always near at hand. "We have everything you'll ever need to have a great time. Where were you thinking of going?" Gary didn't hesitate. "No place special in mind. I don't suppose it has to be very far. We're pretty remote right where we are. Savage, one might even say." A grim smile captured his face. "Very true," Chester chuckled. "I just want to find a clearing where Bud and I can set up away from any artificial light. Then we can get out the telescope and look at the stars." "Yes, I've heard that's a hobby of yours," said Chester. No doubt about it, Gary was warming up to Chester. He'd always thought of him as just another fixture around town. Maybe he'd been hasty in his judgment, and hadn't Adriana spoken highly of Phoebe Nails lately? He'd share some humor with him. "Actually," Gary said, "I have an ulterior motive." Yes, Chester intuitively picked up that a punchline was coming. He was prepared to smile. Gary rose to the occasion. "I want to point out the quadrant of the sky where Bud's grandfather was born." 3 weeks after the shocking event that had his tiny community back on a more serene keel, Sheriff Hoodie was on a pedestrian patrol past the shops and cafes along Main Street. He was well aware everyone in town was waiting for an arrest in the mysterious case of the rocket ship fire at the Willikers' place. Okay, maybe he wasn't the smartest man hereabouts, but there were certain things he couldn't do. Before he'd lost his hair, he'd been a good-looking guy. His formidable size made him a local high school sports hero. He'd been grateful for the advantage when he was younger. It helped him woo and win his ex-wife. Their union had produced the extraordinary creature that was on display every day at the local pharmacy. He wasn't at all happy that every self-deluded stud in town circled her like she was a candy bar. That was life. He presumed it would be ever thus, a male-female dynamic that even crossed genders and always set the agenda. Thursday night, 3 weeks prior, the former Mrs. Hoodie contacted him and asked him to check on their daughter in what had once been their marriage bastion. He generally didn't like going over there, since it reminded him of his reduced circumstances living in a mobile home on the edge of town. But he couldn't ignore his duty when it came to his darling child. He arrived at 29 Shady Lane at 9:30 p.m. and used his old key to let himself in. There was no evidence of Holly in the front rooms. He walked down the hallway that connected to the bedrooms and pushed open her door. Big mistake. There were 2 figures uncovered and entwined on the bed. The one on top was startled by the movement behind him and looked up in mid-thrust. A naked Sydney Steeler stared into the shocked eyes of Sheriff Hoodie. Fistfuls of crap were about to overload the shredder. Holly, still in the throes of pleasure, was at first oblivious to what was transpiring. Harlan Hoodie's frame shook with rage, but before his anger took wing with harsh words, a call came over his walkie-talkie. All 3 occupants of the room could hear the distress message. "There's a fire at the Willikers' place. You'd better get over there right away, Sheriff." Harlan looked at the pair and knew a great divide had been crossed. Relations with his little girl would never be the same again. He rushed out of the house to do his duty, but his thoughts were preoccupied. Worse, in the days that followed, he realized he shared a secret with the devil. Sid was never boastful about his sexual conquest. He did, however, have immunity when it came to talking up his role in the great conflagration. Harlan's hands were tied. He couldn't arrest the individual who was apparently the prime suspect in the case. He was well aware said individual had an ironclad alibi. Whenever anyone asked why he hadn't taken legal action against Sid, given the rumors that were circulating, Harlan would say he didn't have enough proof, but he was keeping an eye on the boy. Besides, in his own mind, he was conflicted. Where was the crime? He knew Adriana Willikers was the culprit. She'd burned down her own property, a misdemeanor at best, since she didn't have a fire permit. He'd checked already. He'd deduced Adriana's culpability on account of her carelessness. Fibers from her purple scarf had caught on some railing that escaped the blaze. Being aware of the inner practices of all the social gatherings in his preserve was part of his job description. If he arrested her, he'd only be tearing a family apart, one that was attempting reconciliation. He knew what it was to live through a breakup. Best to be avoided if there were smoldering remnants of affection. For the sake of his community, this was a case that should remain unsolved on the official blotter. The townsfolk had a better sheriff in Harlan Hoodie than they would ever know. What a life, Harlan thought for the 1000th time that day. He paused in his walk through the beautiful little village where he'd always resided. A lesson from the yoga class he sometimes watched on television surfaced unbidden. Oh well, on the plus side, it's great to breathe deeply and be here in this special space. Harlan was becoming almost New Age in his spirituality. That's a joke, he thought. Wasn't it space that got us into this mess in the first place? The end. And that has been The Peace of Mind Thief by Ted Carrick. Thank you so much for joining me in listening to it. If you're a published author and would like to be featured on Dead to Rights, email me at carrickpublishing@rogers.com and mention Dead to Rights interview in the subject line. We'll be happy to hear from you, and there are still a couple of slots open for 2018. You can find Dead to Rights at deadtorights.ca or at our Facebook page. On Twitter, we're listed as @Dead2RightsPod. Please help us to continue to bring you new and established authors. Podcasters rely heavily on your feedback and support. This is a not-for-profit endeavor, but you can help simply by subscribing absolutely free at your favorite podcast platform. We're available at iTunes or at Google Play. Simply look for Dead to Rights under podcasts. And while you're there, be sure to share some love. A good rating can really help, move our podcast up in the rankings, and allow our authors to reach more new readers. Thanks for doing this. It means a great deal to us here at Dead to Rights and at Carrick Publishing. Bringing you outstanding author tips, writing content, and short stories is our genuine goal. Also, don't hesitate to reach out to us anytime. You can find me, Donna Carrick, at donnacarrick.com or on Facebook as Donna Carrick or Carrick Publishing. My Twitter handle is at Donna_Carrick or at Carrick Pub. My better half, Alec Carrick, is at alexcarrick.com, and that's Alex with an X, or on Facebook. You can tweet him at Alex_Carrick. Our Dead to Rights theme song is Eyes of Gold, composed and performed by Ted Carrick, as is all other story-scoring music. You can tweet with Ted at Ted Carrick, or follow his YouTube channel, Ted Carrick Music. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you next week when we feature Mike Rubin, author of The Cottonwood Curse and Cashed Out.
A dusty road, a man alone. His vital signs go on hold. And I don't know what you've been told, but the years have turned my eyes gold. And I told you what you told me, we'd never be in the same boat for free, yet it rides